Welcome. You're listening to Retirement with Meaning. I'm Carmen Aceta, I'm your host, and this is episode number 7, From Retirement Anxiety to Retirement Joy. This post is mainly meant to try to summarize for you in one place what I found to be helpful to people who have fears and anxiety about their retirement years. And of course, that's a sizable group of people. It summarizes how to move from retirement anxiety to retirement joy. In AA and other 12-step programs, they talk about recovery from addiction being a simple but not easy program. The simple part is the brevity. Don't drink and go to meetings. The not easy part is the significant changes that are sometimes summarized as living life on life's terms, the changes that are required to live out those 6 words. So here is my simple but not easy rationale for how to turn your retirement fears and anxiety into allies so that they don't keep you from the very rich opportunities in this period of our life, the second half of life, or our retirement years, or even just our elder years. Retirement in the second half of life are a time when, like it or not, we experience significant changes that can disorient us, scare us, make us hesitant, and even stop us in our tracks. I believe we're wired for the comfortable, the familiar. We need a certain amount of certainty to be all right. And our retirement years are certainly a huge change from something that we might have done all our life to now something that's new to us and we haven't experienced except secondhand or through observing others and hearing them talk about it. And new and unfamiliar usually means some degree of anxiety, of hesitance, not feeling quite as sure as when we were operating in an area that we were very used to and probably very good at by the time of our life when we retire. The good news about this time period is expressed by Carl Jung as the greatest potential for growth and self-realization exists in the second half of life. And that is certainly a very different pronouncement from what our culture tells us about what we can expect in our retirement in later years. But to capitalize on this very real potential, you'll have to develop a new relationship with an anxiety that assists you in engaging with what feels risky in order to change and grow. The opportunities in the second half of life are very real, but they will be very new, and there's no way to deal with them without dealing with the anxiety and concern that they engender. Even things that are good for us can still make us hesitant and anxious. Another very important aspect that we will need to negotiate is we also need to learn and implement what makes the second half of life very different from the first half, which most likely you've been familiar with and good at, whereas the second half is a big unknown for most people. Much of my podcast will be dedicated to helping people to learn and use what those shifts are and why they're so important and what they can produce. You'll also need to acknowledge your need for support and even seek it out and accept it when it's offered. What gets us through the unfamiliar, the uncomfortable, the new, scary, whatever your reaction is support. Support of others and learning to support ourselves better. So there it is, those fairly simple 5 bullet points, but definitely not easy. I'm in no way suggesting do these 5 things and your retirement years will be a bed of roses. You'll love it. It asks us to take what might seem like the harder path and to accept help or support, which is not easy for most of us. We're usually much more comfortable giving support, helping others, than being helped. And I've found that, unfortunately, it's not a program for everyone. When I talk about this subject, I sort of feel like a candidate for office who is running on a platform that he's going to raise taxes and everybody's going to be better off for it. And I'm basically telling people, yes, I'm offering it. It's kind of a harder path, but it will also pay off with big dividends. And once again, people can think, well, that's not what I decided to retire for. I want to take it easy. I want to kick back. I want to work on my bucket list. I want to have fun. So I don't blame you if you're hesitant, but I hope you'll be able to keep an open mind and give some of this a try so that you can have a chance to see whether it's something, well, I do think it's worth it. A little later in this podcast, I'm going to go over some things with you that are the possibilities, that are some of the payoffs that you can have if you decide to, for one, develop this relationship with anxiety that will allow you to move through whatever anxiety and hesitance, fear, concern you might have. So the second half of life, or retirement years, is actually a time, a very rich and fertile season for growth, for remaking meaning and purpose, among other things. And another aspect we have to take into account is not only dealing with our anxieties and concerns, but staying engaged, because it would be very easy to back off, and now we're not having to satisfy an employer. We generally have much better management of our time. Our time is more hours. And the proverbial rocking chair could look good when we contrast that with actually having to be in a learning, engaged, life on life's terms mode. But this environment is the one in which people grow. I grow, you grow, normally not during our times of peace and calm, but during the times when there is something up in front of us that does not seem particularly easy and causes us some concern. And if we want to grow, then we have to find ourselves taking responsibility for our life, engaging, utilizing the necessary supports, and what might not feel particularly comfortable. And once again, what helps get us through this sometimes push-pull back and forth. Yeah, I want to move that direction, but on the other hand, there's this. And once again, that support. Particularly helpful if it's from like-minded people who also want to grow, who value what you're trying to do and want to help you accomplish it. It's not a good time to be a lone wolf or rugged individualist. So once again, very, very important that being able to use our anxiety as a jumping off place for moving in the direction we want to go and what we want to achieve or have. There's no way to get there without going through our anxiety. If we try to back away from it, let it shut us down, then the prospects of moving ahead, of having a vital, engaged years in our retirement years go way down. And one of the benefits that I haven't mentioned, which is a very real part of all this, is when we do the work of making changes in us, then those positive changes affect everything else that we do for the good. So assuming you have, say, 7 problems that are going to impact your retirement years or you're going into retirement, you don't have to address them as 7 different problems. You don't have to get through the one and think, oh my, now I have 6 more to do yet. Because the work you do on yourself will impact all of those problems and will affect them positively just because you've made that shift in yourself, not out there somewhere in the environment where maybe you just got a new hobby or you took up hiking. And there's nothing wrong with hobbies and hiking, but sometimes they can just be a temporary distraction for us until the issues that we have to face are back in our face again. So the good news is that change in you is the key. And the bad news is change in you is the key because it's going to require some work. And this change aspect is also very important in that I hope if you've heard some of the other podcasts, because the second half of life requires a very different program from the first, and I'll get into that a lot with my podcast as well. And some of the changes required will be from the first half to the second half mode. So once again, you're being asked to leave a way of doing something that you were very familiar with and now make a change to apply something new in the second half of life. And you can certainly decide how much change you want to go for, but change is unavoidable if you really want a retirement with meaning. Even what gives meaning to your life may well shift or be added to, but in a good way. I will be giving some specific, concrete kind of helps about dealing with anxiety to help it be your ally rather than an enemy. But the way out of anxiety is through it. Most of the time we try to avoid it or make it go away if we at all can. But we really need to, what I call experiencing your experience. And that experience of anxiety is disconcerting. Certainly if you have a real panic attack, it doesn't feel good. And if you were on a hike in the woods and you suddenly came face to face with a grizzly bear, you would have a very real sense of risk, and that risk would be very real. You wouldn't be making it up. Sometimes when there's no grizzly bear there, we can still have that very same heightened anxiety, panic, and it feels very real to us, even though you may not be at risk at all. And once again, there really is no growth without at least a perceived sense of risk, which is very real to us. And at times you will feel uncertain, vulnerable, but it's a creative discomfort. It's very different from depression. It's not the fear and anxiety that pulls you back from growing. Instead, you can use it. It's an anxiety that's alive, that's growth-oriented. And when, with help, you've been able to master it and not let it control you, the feeling can be beyond elation into joy. That retirement joy replaces retirement anxiety. Not that you will never feel anxious again, but that you will know you can operate in the presence of it and still get to where you want to go. To support what I just said, I'd like to share a story of one of my early clients who came to me because she had a significant issue with anxiety. It was interfering with her work, it was interfering with her life. And she was faithful to her therapy and worked hard. And one day at the end of a session, she said to me, I think I'm ready to terminate therapy. She said, I realize I'm not going to go through the rest of my life without ever experiencing anxiety. But she said, I think I'm in a better place now to deal with it. I'm confident that I can do that. And so she wanted to talk about the termination process. And we did. She terminated. She did go on to deal with her anxiety successfully, and later she joined one of my second half of life groups and did very good work in that group and would occasionally allude to anxiety about something, but it wasn't derailing her. It wasn't stopping her. It wasn't interfering with her life the way it once did. Okay, I'm going to take time out for a brief infomercial here, and then we'll move on. I want to let you know that I'm now on Facebook after resisting it, I have to admit, for some time. You can access it by either going to Facebook and searching Retirement with Meaning. The URL is facebook.com/Retirement with Meaning. And in line with my new presence on Facebook, soon my podcast will be available on my Facebook page. And that would be hopefully within the next few days. And when I have gotten my podcast safely ensconced on my Facebook page, then I'm going to turn to getting them onto my YouTube channel, which is a little more involved and might take a little longer, but I'll let you know when that happens. One more point. I'd like to suggest to you that you pay attention in the remaining part of the show to how you're being impacted, if you're being impacted, what you're doing with the impact, or just start to notice what impacts you. That might be the simpler start. And what you do once you're felt impacted by something that you heard or that was evoked in you. You can also pay attention to what's being evoked in you, particularly along the line of feelings that come to your mind or thoughts. And to try to do everything I just said, it would be like being a one-armed paper hanger. So you might pick one thing out that actually is happening to you and pay attention. This is one because I'm suggesting this because everything starts with awareness. We can't attend to or do anything with something we're not aware of. So first, it has to enter our awareness, and we have to do something to either retain it or make it leave. So on the one hand, this exercise sort of helps you to become aware, and on the other hand, it helps you to become aware not just of the material, but of yourself. And much of the work in the second half of life is predicated around getting to know yourself better and ultimately getting to know your true self, which Carl Jung writes a good bit about. And of course, you're not limited to just doing this when you're listening to my podcast, but anything that you're exposed to, whether it's a conversation or something from the media, something at work, whatever, that you begin to become more aware of what's going on inside, especially in reaction to stimuli. Okay, back to the earlier subject of the podcast. If I were going to give a subtitle to our next subject here, I would call it something like, "Is it time to shed your old shell?" We should try saying that fast a few times. Time to shed your old shell, time to shed your old shell. But I say this not as a game, but I'm actually referring to something that Dr. Abraham Tversky, who was the founder and medical director of the rehab I worked at, and was revered by recovering addicts internationally and highly respected by his colleagues. Since going from addiction to recovery is a huge step and a big change, he used to talk about the discomfort in change this way. He told about a type of shellfish whose shell did not grow with it. When the shellfish grew, it had to go in search of a bigger shell that it would fit into. Now, while it was out of its old familiar shell, but had not yet found a new shell, it was very vulnerable to predators, to danger of various kinds. And that's how we can feel when we leave the unfamiliar that no longer works, but have not found the new that we are moving towards. It's a difficult but necessary state to inhabit in order to grow. And that's the state that we wind up when we're moving into retirement, which is new, unfamiliar, or into our second half of life. If we return to our small but familiar shell, in quotes, we'll no longer feel vulnerable. We'll feel kind of safe and happy to be back in what we're used to. But also we'll remain stuck in it, stuck in something that no longer serves us very well. And sadly, we'll never experience the rewards of having persevered and gone from retirement anxiety to retirement joy, as I'm talking about here. Perhaps it will even give us a whole new view or perspective of our elder years. And this is why support is so important. It's the game changer, in dealing with our anxiety and other things as well. But it helps us to persevere, and it helps us through the natural resistance that we have to change. And most of us, however, are much better at giving support than receiving it. We're more comfortable with that. So a change required of just about all of us is a willingness to use the support of others, even to ask for it. Support tones down those negative tapes or the stinking thinking that can start playing inside our heads. It helps to reduce feelings of vulnerability. We've got backup. We have help. And it adds resources that the people who are supporting us have that we might not yet have within ourselves. So we get a temporary plug-in that helps us until we can do these things on their own, whatever they are. So here's a true story about support. When I was facilitating drug and alcohol interventions in my therapy practice, my main job was to build an intervention team that was capable of intervening successfully on their addicted loved one. And this was no small feat. By the time that people came to me, they were usually whipped. They were feeling powerless. They were feeling desperate. And they certainly were not in a good place to do an intervention. The addict might have been running amok for years and running the show in the family system. Oftentimes they were divided. They couldn't even agree among themselves what to do. And they couldn't succeed while they were feeling splintered, feeling powerless. So one thing that I did to intervene on their powerlessness was to let them talk about their fears and concerns. And then I put them in the configuration, seated in the room the way they would be in doing the actual intervention sessions. And next, I had everybody but one team member leave the room and imagine the addict was about to enter the room. And he or she was the sole person who would intervene on the addict, mano a mano. So I had each person sit there alone with everybody else had left the room and just call into their mind that soon the intervention would happen. And what if it were just like this? I'm just sitting here by myself waiting for the addict to come in, and I'm the one that's going to intervene. In the next phase, we started out with one person sitting alone, and then another member entered, and slowly another, and another, until they were all seated. I then had them pay attention to the impact on them as they looked around at the others and were no longer the sole person seated in the room. And I kept one person out to play the addict, and that person entered the room after they were all seated and ready. The effect was visible. I could even almost hear the whoosh of relief. Even the addict felt the difference. They began to believe they had power, and then my instructions were more readily accepted. I can't overemphasize the importance of support. It's the game changer, it's the ally in moving you, not from an intervention, but from retirement anxiety to retirement joy, as I'm saying. And I've told you about exterior support, but equally important, if not more so, is interior support, which is learning to support yourself better. And these are among the things I'll be touching on, sometimes in depth, sometimes not so much, as we go along. And I'll just say a very little bit right now. The number of supports, the availability of other supports, might vary with time and circumstances. But hopefully you'll always have you with you. So you're always available to support yourself. And there's some very basic things that can be learned about doing that until you're in a much better position with self-support. Just one for now is you can pay attention to the tapes that want to start playing, to the voices. For the addict, they would be addiction voices. For you, they might be the siren call to come back to the comfort of your original way of thinking and being. So one thing that we can do is begin to answer that voice with a message that contradicts it, that doesn't buy into the message that wants to pull you back, that wants to stop you, wants to keep you from moving forward into greater vitality in your life. And the beauty of this little method is that it will work even if you don't really believe it yet. Merely saying the words that contradict that negative voice that wants to pull you back, it helps, it works, if done over time. Those voices could also come from actual people or circumstances. They don't have to originate with you, and you can still do the same thing in your head to refute, their life-stopping ability. When we've done this enough times, we could arrive at a point which I learned to refer to as standing in your own authority, where you decide your belief, you decide what's right for you, you decide what you want to do in a certain circumstance or circumstances. This doesn't mean that you don't pay attention to what other people say. It doesn't mean you become utterly selfish. It just means that you're able to process information and interactions and not always go with what other people want you to do or what other people undermine you from doing. Not necessarily intentionally, but it's what happens. And especially when we're contemplating changes, those changes may in some way threaten others. Not physically, obviously, but they become disturbing to them. So they want you to get back into your old familiar safe place so that they don't have to deal with the difference in you and maybe something that's calling them to do something similar, but is kind of scary for them. So you might check in with yourself right now, looking back to the time, a short time ago, when I mentioned you're paying attention to what impacts you or doesn't impact you and so on. How's that going for you right now? Are you aware of having been impacted by something since the break? What are you doing with it? If you're not impacted by anything, it could be I'm not a very good speaker, I guess, but on the other hand, it could be that you're doing something to block yourself from being impacted. And these are things that can happen, especially if we're moving towards something that could become difficult for us or make us leave our comfort zone. I want to tell you a little bit now about the field, F-I-E-L-D. Every communication occurs within an environment or field. So when trust, openness, respect, willingness to listen, adequate knowledge, and so forth are present in the field, the outcome is more and more likely to be good for all concerned. But to the extent that negatives occupy the field, the outcome is more likely to be negative. And a big negative quality that can be in the field in a lot of circumstances is distrust, and the opposite of the positive parts that I just listed. So when you add qualities that improve you and add them to your tool bag, you also improve the field. And a well-tended field is another important form of self-support. So you can see I'm talking about growth and change here, which are very important in the second half of life, in our retirement years. Even though we just left a career that we were very good at and had grown a lot in, then what we do with the information, such as I'm giving you here, becomes a very important part of how our retirement years, our second half of life, go for us. I simply don't know how we could do the second half of life without making changes in ourselves and sometimes in our circumstances as well. And particularly the changes that are a part of the important shifts, that's S-H-I-F-T-S if I didn't pronounce it well, that have to occur in the second half of life to help it to go well for us. At this point, you could ask a very legitimate question that would go something like, why take the harder path to a joyful retirement? Why go through all this? Why bear with anxiety? Why work at growing? I paid my dues. I'm ready to take it easy. Maybe not a rocking chair, but close. And I have to admit, I've asked the same questions many times over many years of myself. And I can only share my experience and answer that I came to, but also that of many people I know personally. because the rewards are worth it. Some come pretty much immediately, and some come over time if we continue at the work. And plus, the rewards are not just for me, but other people benefit as well, especially my loved ones, especially my children, my grandchildren, those I'm closest to. And I will be speaking to some of the rewards before closing this particular podcast, and I'll say more in podcasts in the future. I think I will probably give you a fairly good dose of the rewards today and then finish up or add other ones to the next podcast or two. Now, I know that many of you are in the same place that a recovering addict, or maybe still an unrecovering addict, is in when given a similar, similar marching orders to make changes, to move out of what was comfortable for them and into something fairly unknown and uncomfortable. An addict knows, he experiences what his addiction was like and is able to see it in a positive frame for good reasons for him or her. He doesn't know anything about recovery, especially since he's probably been hanging out with mostly addicts during the time of his addiction, so there's no other frame of reference other than getting high and helping each other to get high. And while you're in a better position than an addict is who's contemplating the possibility of recovery, you also don't know, if you're not in retirement already, you don't know what that's going to be like. You haven't learned more about it so that you can feel a little more comfortable. So you've seen people. You may not know what goes on inside them, but you've seen them, their outsides in retirement. So this is new territory, and you kind of, in one respect, have to accept some of this a little bit on faith, but also you can have experiences with people who are in recovery, or not in recovery, but in retirement, and are experiencing some of the rewards. Parenthetically, remembering why you're sacrificing, why you're taking the harder road, is also a means of self-support when you're trying to change. In AA, for instance, it's very common for an alcoholic to think mainly about what she's losing. It feels like her best friend, alcohol, the way she makes it through the day. And that becomes a form of stinking thinking that can stop anyone dead in their tracks if not addressed, and can also stop you in your tracks toward a different goal, but a similar process. Take a moment now to check in with yourself again. How are you reacting to, or what are you hearing even, when you start to hear about why take the harder path, especially when you don't yet know what the outcome will be? And I'll allow a little dead air time for you to do that here. Go ahead. If in your personal situation, then, you think only about what you appear to be losing, that thinking will stop you too. So remember, support, support, support. As with AA, the support is particularly valuable when it's coming from those who are on your similar journey, but farther along the path. And just being around people who are alive and growing and hopeful can be supportive, just as being around their opposites can drag you down. And unfortunately, when we get to our retirement years, there can be no shortage of people who are in a rather negative place for any number of reasons. And if we join them where they are, we can wind up like them. I'm not saying not to be compassionate, but to be careful that you don't get pulled back when there's a part of you that wants to be alive and growing, but may not be there yet, and you're still vulnerable to negative influences. That feeling of loss is quite natural and can be quite strong, the feeling that we're losing something. So you might frequently have to remind yourself about what you're gaining or want to gain. once again, even if you don't believe it yet, it still helps to offset the voice that wants to pull you back from growing and moving on. Try to reply to that familiar negative voice, whether it's in your own head or from your own environment, with your own positive statement that contradicts it. And it's also supportive to take in the positives that other people try to support you with. And as they say in AA about the program, it works if you work it. So this is definitely something that needs to be worked at, but once again, can pay big rewards. So if you're resonating with things that I've been saying, now here's a positive voice for you to also put in your toolkit. I can't say often enough that the second half of life is not the end of our useful life, as our youth worshiping culture would have us believe. And if you can remember Carl Jung's quote from earlier, the greatest potential for growth and self-realization exists in the second half of life. So I'm about to give you a sampling of the opportunities awaiting you in the second half of life, or your retirement years, or your elder years. So now, are you ready for some good news? Here it is. The second half of life is a mulligan, or a do-over time in our life. It's a second chance, so to speak. We get to try to do some things over again, but this time differently, or to take on brand new things that we weren't even aware of. Many people, when they're close to retirement or in early retirement, somewhere along that path, a natural thing to wonder is, well, what will be the purpose of my life? What will give it meaning when I'm separated from myself as a worker, or this career or that career, and having made contributions for a long time in my life? The good news is that the second half is a very fertile season for remaking meaning and purpose. And this will become more and more clear if you stick with the podcast and avail yourself to information that has not been made available yet, but will be. It can actually be a time for personal transformation. As I've mentioned before, there's an awful lot of information in our culture. But the information in that quantity can actually hold us back or be destructive, because there's so much of it, nothing really emerges for us. There's a whole lot to pay attention to try to make some meaning or sort it out. So what I try very hard to do is help people to not only take in information, but to do with it what can lead to transformation, which makes you, in a way, not a whole new person, but certainly transformed in some significant way. Now, for instance, if a caterpillar goes into a cocoon and goes through the process that it goes through, it doesn't just come out as a better, bigger caterpillar. It comes out as a whole new creature. When it went in, it looked a certain way, it behaved a certain way, but when it comes out, it is now beautiful. It has beautiful colors. It has gossamer wings. It can fly. Instead of being destructive and chewing up vegetation, it becomes a pollinator and can actually help plants to grow and spread and so on. And when that caterpillar was going into the cocoon, he could have been thinking or saying, I don't know about this. What's going to happen while I'm in here? What if it's not good? What if I don't like what I come out of here as? Natural questions that we ask ourselves. But we're talking about not just a little, polish job, a little spiffing up, but talking about an actual transformative experience. Now, you may choose whether to only go for a part of that bundle, and that's fine. That's a decision that's yours to make. But the potential is there. The possibility is very real. That rather than have this kind of declining period of your life heading to your demise, you are actually growing in ways that might surprise you and might even surprise the people around you. And although our bodies experience the natural diminishments of aging, even the top international athletes eventually can't do what they did as well and then can't do it at all. But it's a prime time for spiritual growth. And in fact, if we remain active, we can greatly delay the physical decline. But generally, the issues in the second half of life have a strong spiritual component. Whether we're doing something or trying to do something that has a very concrete aspect, there's still a spiritual component there that we might not have been aware of or been very interested in earlier in our lives when we were very busy. I don't know if anybody gets out of this life without having experienced some pretty difficult trials. But one of the opportunities in the second half of life is to heal from past traumas and losses. And of course, the longer we go in life, the more losses we're going to experience. I remember being quite young, maybe even in my pre-college years, and I was the youngest of 8 siblings. I had 4 sisters and 3 brothers. And it came to me that barring a catastrophic illness of my own or a fatal accident, that I would most likely live to see each of my siblings, die and be left as the last one of us. And that has come to be true. Within the last couple of years, my last sister, who was 95, died, and I am the last remaining person of my family, at least my immediate family of origin. So living our second half of life well and knowing what we need to do, what helps that to happen, is also a very good way of dealing with losses. And on the other hand, we can come to terms with what might not ever be that we had wanted, something that perhaps we longed for all of our life, and now we realize we've done what we could and there's nothing more we can do other than to come to terms with it and to deal with and heal the loss. On the other hand, lifelong longings can finally be realized and attained. There's something going on in the second half of life which is sort of a call to us. Carl Jung writes about this among other people. And it's a time, if we're attuned, that we can get in touch with that longing and begin to do something about it. We can also come to terms with our own dying, and in that process, add vitality to our remaining years rather than the gloom that I'm getting older and closer to dying every day. Second half is also a time to determine the legacy that we want to leave behind us. And I just don't mean the financial legacy, although that's certainly very important also. But what we want to have given, especially to those closest to us perhaps, that's not of a financial nature. How we want to perhaps have helped society or the planet or whatever it is for you. I've noticed myself as my later years, especially the recent ones, that I've become very tuned in to how I want to try to help my family, especially my children and grandchildren, to live in the years that are coming, in which the signs right now point to could be pretty difficult. We're also in a position in our second half of life to give back to the world from our accumulated experience and wisdom. And sometimes when I think of all the experience and wisdom that's sort of warehoused in various places in the community, it really doesn't give much chance to give from the wealth of experience and wisdom gained through a lifetime. All right, there's more, but I think I'm going to save some of that for the next podcast and possibly ones after that. And this one has run longer than I usually go with my podcast, but I didn't want to short you on the good news. So I think I will let its length be what it is and start to wrap up. And here's the final thought that I believe is an important one, that to attain the retirement years of the second half of life that you aspire to, you'll have to move consciously into and through your retirement years. And this can require looking inward as well as outward. That inward look is a very important part of the shifts in the second half of life. And my hope for you, although it doesn't have to be your hope for you, is that you'll engage and keep on keeping on and utilize that S word, support. And stick with this. I certainly offer what I have to offer to you. I'm certainly not the only source. And then enjoy the results of your efforts, some of which can come very quickly. I've always been surprised at the progress people can make when in the second half of life mode. So as always, thanks for listening. Podcast number 8 is What to Do in Retirement. How about grow yourself? I'm going to begin talking about the very important shifts from the first half of life to the second half of life that are necessary. And in closing, I offer you the following quote from Angeles Arrien, who also wrote a lot about the second half of life. This quote is from her book titled The Second Half of Life. The descent into darkness, the unknown or undeveloped aspects of our nature, and the ascent into greater awareness, authenticity, and faith lead us to a discovery of our essential selves beyond egos and personal desires. In both directions, we encounter our shadows, the unclaimed, undesired, and unbefriended aspects of our nature. To become fully developed human beings, we must confront both our demons and our angels. If we can do this successfully, we free ourselves from the illusion of who we think we are. We are delivered into the mystery of our true essential being and are able to generate a new domain of freedom that is anchored in wisdom, love, and faith.